Music 292, Weeks 5 and 6. Part 1, Reading Chord Charts and Lead Sheets. Hello, class! So this is our pop music unit for this course, and I'm going to talk about a couple different aspects of that. I'm going to prepare you for a composition project that's going to be one of your major assignments for this course, but I'm also going to talk about some of the typical harmonic paradigms, how to read things like chord charts and lead sheets, and also just some of the standard conventions that differ between pop music and between classical music. I'd like to start by pointing out that not all pop styles are the same now. There's a tremendous variety depending on time period, subgenre, geographic location, and a host of other factors. So what I'm teaching you is just kind of like generalized rules about pop music. Not every single rule is going to apply exactly the same to every single genre. R&B, for example, is going to differ pretty significantly from heavy metal. So keep in mind that these 2 weeks really give an overview rather than giving specifics about these styles. Let's get started. Today we're going to look specifically at how to read chord charts. Chord charts are basically a representation of music where rhythm and meter are not specifically notated, but you get the lyrics and then you're also given the chords and how those line up in comparison to the lyrics. I have an example on screen for you right now. With chord charts, it really matters that you know what the music sounds like prior to looking at the chord chart. You're not going to be able to create a new rendition of the song without understanding how things like the chord changes actually fit into the meter. So this is really meant as more of a memory tool more than anything else. If you want to go and you want to perform this piece, this is sort of your shortcut to remembering what your lyrics are and remembering where your chords change. There's a few things about reading chord charts that are different than what we expect from classical style music, and I'd like to go over that in today's video. First of all, chords are represented quite differently. Chords are not represented with Roman numerals typically in pop and jazz styles. They're represented with chord symbols. And the chord symbols are related to what we know already, but there are some slight differences. To represent chords, a letter plus a sharp or flat symbol is going to indicate what the root of the chord is. So if you just see the letter F, for example, that's telling you the root of the chord is F, and you're going to stack the rest of your notes on top of that. Your standard abbreviations are as follows. And just before we get started, just to note, I'm going to use the little b to use instead of flat, partly because a lot of the chord charts you'll see on the internet will do that, partly because PowerPoint really doesn't like the music font that I have installed. It tends to make the flats too small to see. So what can we expect with chords in pop music? Well, if we have a letter only, that's going to indicate a major chord. We can think of major as essentially being our default chord quality in both pop and jazz styles. If you're going to have something like a minor chord, it's going to indicate it explicitly. And that's going to be either with the lowercase m or lowercase ma, like you can see in my second example. An F minor chord is going to be shown with F and then lowercase m. The default quality in terms of seventh chords is what we think of as the dominant seventh, what I've been calling the major minor seventh in this course. So if you see a letter with the number 7 beside it, you're going to assume that's major minor quality. So F7, for example, is going to mean F, A, C, E flat. If, on the other hand, you want to use a major seventh, that's going to be indicated explicitly in the symbol. You will see MA or uppercase M to show that difference. So F, MA7 is going to mean an F major seventh chord, F, A, C, E natural. If you see a seventh attached to an F minor chord, you're going to assume the seventh is minor. You do sometimes see diminished quality chords in this music as well, and DIM is the usual abbreviation for that, although you do sometimes see the little circle like you see in classical music. Half diminished chords, though, are represented in quite a different way in pop and jazz styles than regular diminished chords. Half diminished chords are really understood in jazz and pop styles as being modifications of minor chords, where you take a minor seventh chord and you flatten the fifth. So jazz performers are coming at this from a slightly different angle. They're not really understanding this as a diminished chord. This is a little bit different in pop styles. Pop styles tend to represent these more often as diminished chords, and it's part of just where some of the harmonic traditions come through. So I'm going to keep these abbreviations on screen while we take a look at a few elements. But just a quick note, there's one other thing that will sometimes come up in jazz and pop notation, and that's what's called slash notation. A slash followed by a note name indicates the base note of a chord when a chord's an inversion. So jazz and pop don't use figures like we do in classical music to show inversion. If you see something, for example, like F/A, what that means is that you have an F chord with A in its base. If you have something like C minor 7/G, that means you have a C minor 7th chord with G as the base note. A lot of the time, the bass notes are not notated, even when you do hear them in inversion in recordings, for example. The default is basically that the chord is either in root position or it's up to the performer to make the decision about what inversion it's in. So there's a lot more flexibility in pop and jazz styles about inversion. There's a few other abbreviations that I don't have on this slide, but which I'll add sort of to our knowledge as we go through. The 6 notation, for example, in jazz is a little bit different, but we're not going to encounter it in our analysis in this unit. So I'm going to introduce that later. All right, let's take what we've just learned and apply it to a chord sheet to do a little bit of deciphering here. So we're going to take a quick listen to the introduction and the first verse of the song Happy.
It might seem crazy what I'm about to say. Sunshine, she's here, you can take a break. I'm a hot air balloon that could go to space. With the air, like I don't care, baby, by the way.
So we can see in this piece that there's a couple different symbols being used. When we see the uppercase letter plus the 7, like we talked about before, the default quality for 7th chords is major, minor, 7th. So that F7 is going to be an F, so-called dominant 7th chord, F, A, C, E flat. You can see there's an F minor 7 that comes up next in our first line of our verse. So once again, minor 7 is going to be understood to mean minor, minor 7th in this repertoire. B flat and C, because there's no other accompanying symbols, we're going to assume those are major chords. And then B flat 7 again is going to be understood as a major, minor 7th, because that's the default quality for 7ths. And so we can take these things and we can actually translate them to Roman numerals to help us understand maybe some of the differences between classical styles and pop music styles. Let's take a quick minute and do this now. We're going to assume that the tonic is actually F for this piece. So we can take each of our symbols and we have enough information to be able to create Roman numerals out of these things. F7, for example, if F is our key, we know that F is going to be the tonic. And so therefore, this is going to be some form of 1 chord. But we can see some differences pretty immediately stylistically. 1/7s are basically do not occur in classical style. But here we hear it right off the bat. Something that's supposed to be stable and is supposed to reinforce our key has a 7th attached to it. And that's pretty common in pop music style. It's also really common in jazz style. We've got a little bit of modal mixture here in our second chord, F minor 7. We go from a major quality F chord to a minor quality F chord. So once again, we're using a lot of the same concepts we've learned already in this class for classical music. Some of these have been ported over to these more modern pop styles. B flat is the 4th note of F major, so this is a 4 chord. C is the 5th note of F major, so this is a 5 chord. Both of these are the usual qualities we would expect in F major. And then B flat 7 at the end of the phrase, well, this is a little bit different. This is a 4 chord, but it's got that added 7th, and that added 7th is going to be, if we work out the intervals for major, minor 7th chord, is going to be A flat. So there's a little bit of a difference here compared to what we would expect in classical style. You also might have noticed that the music repeats this exact same chord progression a whole bunch of times. And that repetition is also really characteristic of pop music. It's quite common to repeat a chord progression from one line to the next in the music. And that kind of repetition doesn't tend to happen quite so small scale in classical style. So 2 things we've already noticed then. We have more extensive use of 7th chords in places we don't expect them to happen in classical style. And we have a lot more shorter scale repetition of harmonic progressions. You also might have noticed that we're not using TSDT ordering anymore. So going from F to B flat to C is maybe what we expect, 1, 4, 5. But back to B flat, back to the 4, isn't really the TSDT ordering that we typically expect for classical music. And that's also quite common in pop music styles, that they don't follow TSDT. We're going to talk about this in much more depth in the 4th video of this unit. So I'd like you to take a minute to do this exact same process with the chorus of this exact same song. Let's have a listen, and then I want you to translate these into Roman numerals in the key of F major.
Because I'm happy, clap along if you feel like a room without a roof. Because I'm happy, clap along if you feel like happiness is the truth. Because I'm happy, clap along if you know what happiness is to you. Because I'm happy, clap along if
probably noticed in translating the chorus to Roman numerals is that we have much more of an influence of F minor happening here than we do F major. The D flats, for example, are in the key signature of F minor, although they're not in the key signature of F major. The C minors are more typical of F minor rather than F major. So this isn't just mode mixture at this point. This almost seems like it's a modulation. In some pop music, and indeed in some Romantic period classical music, there's actually an ambiguity of whether you're in the major or minor key at any point. And some of the pieces actually switch very smoothly between them. So we can say that this thing is just in F rather than specifying major or minor, and then use chord qualities, uppercase versus lowercase Roman numerals, to show the difference as we go through. In this case, in the chorus, we have a 4/7 chord going to a 6 chord. That one's derived from the minor key. Going to a 5 chord, derived from the minor key. Going to a different inversion of that 5 chord. Going back to the tonic chord with the 7th added. You'll notice here that the raised leading tone is not actually being used. And that again is also pretty characteristic of pop music styles. This lowered leading tone is actually really, really common. Pop music tends to use modes a lot more than classical style does. And part of the effect of this is this actually weakens the sense of dominant here. Because we're weakening the dominant, we don't hear it as a tension release anymore. We might hear it as more of a connection kind of thing, more like subdominant function. All right, let's talk about the differences between chord charts and lead sheets. Lead sheets, unlike chord charts, give the full melody, including the rhythm. Although in practice, performers are expected to actually vary this according to their own personal preferences. So I've got 2 examples here. The top is the chord chart that we just looked at. The bottom is just 2 lines from a lead sheet, from a typical jazz lead sheet. This is in treble clef, by the way. So you'll notice right away a few differences. You'll notice that the melody is actually notated in the lead sheet. You'll notice there's a B in the second system. That's actually indicating some elements of form here. You'll notice as well that there's a little bit more precision in showing how the rhythms line up with meter and how those line up with the chord changes. Harmonic rhythm, by the way, is a term that I'm going to use in this class to indicate chord change. Harmonic rhythm means how frequently the chords change and where they change. So lead sheets are much more common in jazz. Chord charts tend to be a lot more common in pop music, although they do switch between the 2 genres as well. Lastly, I want to go over what to expect when we see these sorts of formats in pop and jazz music fully notated out. The full notation is going to look a lot more like classical scores that you expect, but there are some key differences. Here's an example. This is from a Beatles tune. And you're going to notice a few different components here. So typically when you have vocals, they're going to be indicated as the top line of your music. Any additional instruments, what we think of as sort of our extra melody instruments, are going to go below that. And then we have what's called the rhythm section at the bottom of our score. So guitar, bass, and then drum set at the very bottom. Take a look at the guitar in particular. You'll notice here that the note shapes are a little bit wonky. They don't look like they're quite pitches in the same way. And that's because they're not. These are actually just there to indicate the rhythm of the strumming on the guitar. The actual chords are indicated as letter names above the score, and that's using the exact same kind of notation that we just talked about. You'll see a 9th chord in this particular example, the B9. 9th chords work exactly the same in this style as what we learned for classical style. And again, if there's no quality indicated, the default is assumed major, minor, 7th with a 9th added onto it. So that guitar is indicating the pulsing rhythm, and it's also indicating where the chords change. You'll also notice there's more frequent use of the repeat symbol for bars that duplicate themselves exactly. A lot of pop music and jazz music tends to really go for shortcuts because the people arranging these things are often doing so very much at the last minute. Or at least that's how the tradition arose in the first place. You'll notice that the bass parts tend to be fully notated, although certainly professional bass players will improv off just chord symbols as well. They're quite adept at doing that. And you'll notice for the drum set that there's different shapes and different pitches that are used to indicate different components of the drum set itself. So drum sets themselves can include things like hi-hats, snares, toms, and cymbals. It tends to be that X symbols are used for hi-hats and various other symbols. The mid-range note, which is notated as E on the scores, tends to be used for the snare drum. And the lower range pitch, which on this score, there's no example here, but on a future page it comes up, will generally be noted as A for the bass drum. This score is also a little bit different in that it's showing drum set and bass clef. It technically should be showing drum set with the 2 lines clef because there's no specific pitch to these things. So that's a little bit about forms of notation that are different than classical style. What you can expect when you're looking at chord charts, when you're looking at jazz lead sheets, and when you're looking at transcriptions or notations of these pieces. You're going to encounter these in a wide variety of formats, and you're going to encounter these in a wide variety of places. If you're doing your own pop music performance, if you're working with other musicians who don't necessarily read music, a lot of the times they'll be able to read things like chord symbols. So they will be able to read chord charts and sometimes elements of lead sheets. So it's a really good way to be able to communicate between the various systems. Thanks for watching. In our next video, I'm going to talk a little bit about forms and popular styles. See you next time.
Bring me down.